Welcome everyone. This week we're going to spend time talking about how to do persuasive speaking. And so before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between an opinion and a persuasive speech and even an informative and persuasive speech. So the difference between informative and persuasive is obviously that in informing, you're just giving people information about something. Whereas when you're persuading, you're trying to get them to change their mind or to change their habits in some way to do something differently. So that's really the difference between informative and persuasive speech. The difference between opinion and persuasive speech is a little bit more nuanced. When I'm giving my opinion on something, I'm not necessarily telling you I need you to believe what I'm believing or do anything differently. I'm just telling you this is what I believe. Whereas when you're doing a persuasive speech, your goal is not just to give people your opinion on something. Your goal is to get people to change their mind or change their habits as a result of having been persuaded by your speech. So let's talk about some ways to do that. One of the first things we want to talk about is something called social judgment theory. And what this means is that when you're thinking about an audience and giving a speech on something, you have to think about the degrees of persuasion that are allowable. So all the way on the left-hand side, you have strongly opposed, and all the way on the right-hand side, you have strongly in favor. And one of the things you want to think about is, based on your topic and based on your audience, how likely is it that you're going to be able to move them along this spectrum? So let me give you an example. If I am going to a vegan conference to talk about how amazing eating meat is, then what is your guess in terms of how the audience is going to feel about my topic on this continuum? That's right. They're probably going to be strongly opposed because they obviously don't like eating meat. So what does that mean for my speech? It means that I'm probably not going to get them to move that much. The most I can hope for is maybe moving them from strongly opposed to moderately opposed, or if I'm really trying to go for it, maybe to slightly opposed. But there's probably not a lot of likelihood that I'm going to make them go from strongly opposed to strongly in favor. That's just not realistic. Now, if it's something that's a little bit less contentious, then maybe it's somebody who hasn't really thought about something yet. They might be right in the middle in that white space where they don't really have an opinion about something. They're actually hearing it or you're presenting the information for the first time, and therefore you're more likely to be able to move them into a moderately or slightly favorable position. So it's really important when you're thinking about your audience and when you're thinking about your topic to decide how far you think you can move them and where they might start on based on your topic and who they are. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit are the 5 steps of the process of persuasion. These are McGuire's steps of process of persuasion. It's an incremental process. So think about it this way. You start out at a level of awareness, then understanding, then agreement, then enactment, and then integration. This isn't what you do as the speaker. This is what the audience goes through as you're persuading them on your topic. And it really depends where the audience is going to fall, depending on how much you persuaded them and how much they walked in knowing about the information. So if they know nothing about what it is you're talking about, then that first stage is just, I didn't know, and now I'm aware. Maybe they didn't know that climate change is a problem. You talked about the importance of climate change and why we need to get better at changing the way we live. And they're like, okay, now I'm aware that this is a problem. So that's the first stage. The second stage is the understanding stage. So if number 1 is aware, number 2 is I understand your point of view. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with your point of view, but I certainly understand where you're coming from. The third stage is agreement. Not only do I understand where you're coming from, I agree with you. Now, when you're giving a speech, this is probably the most that you as a speaker can know that the audience has gotten to in terms of their processing of the 5 stages, because the last 2 often happen after they leave the speech. Enactment, think of the word act in the middle of enactment. It means that they act differently based on the information that they have heard. So maybe after hearing about climate change, they go home and they start to get better at putting different things to recycle in different places. They're like, look, that is my enactment. I am now, today I took all my plastics and I put them in the recycling, which I'd never done before. That would be the 4th step. The integration step is where it really starts to fit into your values. Not only are you the person who takes their recyclables and puts them in the right bin, you're somebody who takes climate change seriously and feels that that is an issue that is core to your value system. So these are the 5 stages. And again, depending on where they are on social judgment theory that we just looked at before, you have to decide how far through these processes you can push somebody as you're trying to speak to them. Again, going back to the vegan conference and trying to get them to want to eat meat, you're probably not going to get them to the integration and enactment stage. The most you might get them to is maybe understanding. So maybe they come in with this, like, people who eat meat are bad, and maybe you've done such a great job of persuading them that they're not going to change their mind about what they do, but they get a better sense of where you might be coming from your perspective. So then you think, okay, that's as far as I can push this audience, is to that second stage of understanding. This is the same model, McGuire's model of the persuasive process in a visual form, so that those of you who have a better sense of being able to see it visually can understand it. The first stage, as we said, is the awareness stage. I didn't even know we had a problem. The second stage is the understanding. I think I see it now. The third stage is agreement. Okay, I'll buy that. The fourth is enactment. Let's do it. Let's get busy. And then the fifth one is integrating into your values. What we're doing now fits right into our values and is core to who we are as people. So that is the model of the persuasive process and the 5 stages of them. The next thing I want to talk about is, as you're thinking about your persuasive speech, is what kind of organizational pattern would you like to use? Now, we've talked about all of these except for one, and that's the refutative. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. So problem solution we talked about, right? Here's the problem, here's the solution. Problem cause solution, very similar. Here's the problem, here's the cause, and here's the solution. Monroe's motivated sequence, you remember that's the one with the 5 steps. You have the one that's like, here's the hook or the attention getter that gets your attention. Then you have what is the need, what is the satisfaction step, basically how you satisfy that need. And then the one that's really unique to Monroe's motivated sequence is the 4th step, which is the visualization. Visualizing yourself having gotten that need fulfilled. And then the last step is the action step. What are the next steps? How do I make this happen? Comparative advantages, we talked about you can do in either informative or persuasive. But in a persuasive, it would be showing different things and showing how one is actually better than the other. So if I'm doing a persuasive speech, I'm showing the differences between an Apple and an Android, or Coke and Pepsi. At the end of that, I'm going to say, and that's why Pepsi is better than Coke, or that's why the iPhone is better than the Android. The one that we haven't talked about that I think is a really helpful model for persuasive speeches is the refutative design, which comes from the word to refute, which means to take something and show that they're wrong by tearing down their arguments. So think about it this way. A good way to design for persuasion using refutative is to take all of the arguments of the other side and one by one explaining why they're incorrect or why they're wrong. So if I were going to go back to the vegans at that conference, I might think about what are all the pushback that I would get from my position on meat. What are they going to say about their position that I can refute? Maybe they'll say that, you know, you can get a better diet eating vegan than you can eating meat. Maybe that's one. Another one might be eating meat is harmful to the environment and it's harmful to animals. So I would take those different concepts, and each one of those would be one of my main points, where I then refute and talk about why that position that they hold is wrong. So that's the last one, the refutative. I think this is a really important one because anytime you're designing a persuasive speech, you really want to go through that process anyway, because you want to understand and get in the head of the people that might disagree with you and say, what can I say to convince them of my point of view? So those are the designs. The one thing I want to talk about today that is very new are the types of claims that you use. Now, it's not too new because we've talked about earlier a purpose statement, And claims is nothing more than a fancy word of a purpose statement, but put in a very specific way when you're designing persuasive speeches. So let's take a look at 3 of them: claim of fact, claim of value, and claim of policy. So if you're doing a claim of fact, what it means is that your specific purpose is going to be an argument that makes a claim about a specific fact. Now, it doesn't have to be a fact. It just means that you're positioning it as if it is. So the example here is the death penalty does not deter crime. Even if I wrote the opposite, the death penalty does deter crime, notice that obviously one or the other of those is right and the other one's wrong. But the point is that both of them are put in a claim of fact in terms of their specific purpose. So that tells you that as an argument, you are trying to convince people is or isn't, right? That's the answer that you're trying to answer is, are you putting this in the sense that it is a fact? So that's the claim of fact. The second one is the claim of value. This is where your specific purpose makes an assertion that's more about a moral, an aesthetic, or philosophical topic. It deals with worth or morality, with right or wrong. The example, again, if we're going to use the death penalty, is capital punishment is unjust. Right? That's not a fact, that's an opinion. But you're putting it out there as trying to convince people that it is morally wrong to kill people. If you think a lot about in society some of the major issues that people tend to get upset about or feel very core values around, they're not always claims of fact, they're claims of value about things. And that tends to be where we clash the most in our differences of opinion. So that is the value. The last one is a claim of policy. This is an argument in which you're trying to get the reader to take a certain course of action or policy. It doesn't have to be an actual governmental policy. In this case, it is. The death penalty should be abolished. But it's basically where there's a course of action that should or should not be taken based on your argument. So notice that all 3 of these are still about the death penalty. So you can take any topic, and the way that you put together your specific purpose dictates whether you're making a speech based on a claim of fact, a claim of value, or a claim of policy.